Perfect. Okay, so first an intro and a welcome. So welcome to our session today, which, as you know, is on how to optimize your forms and checkouts. I have with me Griffin from Optimizely, who will introduce himself shortly. But I am Alan from Zuko. I'm the managing director of Zuko. For those of you who don't know Zuko, we're a specialist form analytics product. So we provide deep insights into why people are dropping off forms at a detailed field level. We're the only player who specializes purely in form analytics. If you're looking for the type of reports we get, I'll give you an idea of my favorite report on Zuko, which is essentially the field flow report on a failed submit. So you can see what people are doing after they fail to submit, where are they jumping back to, leads you to quickly identify the problems on your form. Before I hand over to Griffin, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be doing this for about 30 minutes with a bit of Q&A, so may overrun. So let's see how we go. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. We may respond immediately. We may save them to the end, depending on how we're going with individual pieces. So what I shall do now is hand over to Griffin, who will introduce himself.
Hey everybody, I'm Griffin Cox. I'm the Senior Technical Product Manager on Optimizely's flagship full-stack experimentation product called Feature Experimentation. I've been with Optimizely since April as a product manager. Before then, I was an engineer at a Chicago-based fintech, where my first passion actually was, I kid you not, and I'm totally serious, optimizing forms. That company, the brand I worked for was a Brazilian loan product primarily. And it was kind of a glorified form. We had something like 30 fields. We needed a lot of data to be able to underwrite and approve customers for loans. And there was a lot of friction, particularly around the Brazilian equivalent of, say, a social security number, something really sensitive, right? And that's what really got me digging into making the errors better, breaking down the form into several different pieces so it didn't seem as long, kind of saving their progress as they go. I really got in the weeds with it as an engineer. And then in terms of experimentation, Optimizely's products, both web and feature experimentation, really support experimentation on forms. And that can take kind of two categories of use case. So experimentation between forms, where you're basically routing a user to a different URL and presenting them with a different form to see if that one's maybe better, or within a form, where you're maybe hiding and showing fields to see within a single form whether you can convert higher with, say, fewer fields or a different user experience. So I think my experience is actually really relevant for this conversation, and I'm really excited to have it with you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I should add one last plug before we go into the meat of it, that Zuko is a partner of Optimizely's. We've got a direct integration, so you can actually do A/B testing and see Zuko data on different test variants. But that said, let's get into forms. So in terms of questions, there's a lot of questions about forms. And what are some of the most common questions that you would get by clients and users of Optimizely, or in previous roles about forms? What are the things people ask?
Yeah, I'd actually almost flip that question on its head and say, I don't think I got enough questions about forms from my product team. A form in its most high sense is a collection of fields, may or may not have validation, may or may not have help text. And you have to submit them, you get the data in usually a back end, and then you can start to change the user experience. Maybe they're buying a product and they're checking out, or maybe they're creating an account. But it's really a method, right, for users to input data in a secure, hopefully user-friendly way. And it's really that last part that was always problematic. At the beginning, before I was able to really show massive conversion gains just by changing those kinds of things, it was hard to convince my product teams that it was worth trying. And I wish we had a product like Zuko, to be honest, while we were doing that, but we were using Adobe at the time. And Adobe it was a lot worse then 5 years ago than it is now. And for those of you with Adobe experience, you probably feel my pain. All I need to say is, docs. Yeah, so not enough questions.
Yeah.
What about you? Is it kind of similar or?
Yeah, well, we obviously speak mainly with our clients. They know about forms, they recognize the need to fix forms, so that's a good starting point. But obviously,
Yep.
we also speak to people who are not sure; they've got to justify it in the business. So we
Yep.
get a lot of questions, and but the main thing is to focus and identify the UX issues. So one of the issues that we often get asked is, okay, we've got a form, it's maybe got 10 to 20 fields. Should we put it all on one page or should we do multi-step? And that's often, a good starting point. Now, obviously, we've got opinions, we've seen data on this, but do you have any thoughts from an experimentational standpoint?
Yeah, so I started on like the first version of the form that I was an engineer kind of behind. It already was multi-step, and the reason was presenting a user like 10 fields, maybe 8 fields at a time. You might actually know the optimal number of fields to present. Maybe you could comment on that when I'm done. But yeah, we would present about 10 fields. We'd start with the ones that had the least friction, basically the non-PII ones, like what sort of loan do you want? Why do you want it? What's your job situation like? That sort of stuff where it isn't personally identifiable, really. But then once you start to get towards the second and third step, it's, like I mentioned, basically asking for some pretty sensitive information, including like a bank routing number and that sort of stuff. And that's where the drop off would happen
Yeah.
for the most part. But the steps really, there's a way of presenting progress in a multi-step form where you can, without being disingenuous, you can still sort of convey that they're making significant progress. I think you're bringing up an example now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so the first time I've got the case for multi-step, you can see, often you see that form enough to scare people away quickly. But then, there's other ways of doing it, such as this, which I think is what you're talking about.
Yep. Yep, and then even on the right there, where you ask for a billing address, and then you, rather than ask for a full delivery address again, I think we all probably love that little box that says, just it's the same as my billing address, right? Yeah. It can be a joy to fill out a form. Maybe that sounds a little bit weird, but you know it when you're filling out a form that isn't a joy. And has, in the worst case, a validation issue where the data that they're even instructing you to put in is giving an error. There's almost nothing more frustrating than that. And then you just, you rage quit more or less.
Well, so we've got some examples of errors. Validation, are you validating at the right time here? But I see, just slowly taking it back to what you were talking about in terms of when you ask the questions, how many per step. We don't have specific advice on that. Typically, the advice is to keep similar questions together, although we'd always advise, assuming you've got the right amount of traffic to test and experiment, to make sure you're doing that. But it always intrigues me about the order that you ask for information, because that's always crucial. And also, we found with our clients that it varies by sector. I think you were talking about financial sector as well. And what we find is actually on normal forms, often you ask the simple, easy questions, name, email address first. And if you ask those first, you're more likely to get people to continue because they're easy questions. However, in the financial sector is not always the case, particularly in something like insurance, because people are there just to check their eligibility or check their get an insurance quote. And if you start asking them for that information at the start, they are going to assume you're going to be bombarding them with sales messages, spam. Whereas so it's like, okay, just put the information in. What's your car? What's the mileage? Give me a quote, and then if I like that, then I'll give you my email address. So and you can see that the way that works is when it's flipped, you get a better. Well, historically, we've seen a better conversion rate for insurance when they flip it and don't ask for personal information later. Whereas the opposite's true for something, say an education form, as an example.
Yeah, totally. There's a common sort of, I want to say two things on this point. So first, there's a common misconception, I think, in experimentation where it's all about let's add something and see if it's better. I think it's less obvious to think about removing something. And those experiments are actually easier to run because the code is already in there and now it's just like hide it, let's see if that's better, right? It's easier than developing a new field, etc., right? And so I think when you're developing particularly like a longer form,
Mhm.
questioning whether you truly need that information, step
Mhm.
one. Step two, make sure that you need it now.
Mhm.
So, in the underwriting process, for example, we needed like a phone number in Brazil that's kind
Mhm.
of used to look a lot of things up, that sort of stuff. So we had to ask for that sooner. But if we could have delayed moving it like back, maybe even after the underwriting process, that would have been probably better. And so you see it sometimes when companies are playing around with like when they ask for an email, when they ask for a phone number, and it's basically like you want to ask for as little as you truly need,
Mhm.
and at the right times, and that's both an art and a science. And I think your tool actually really helps with that.
Yeah, and I think it's a tricky one because having done sessions with this with various form experts and form practitioners, it's important to have a framework at the start. What do you need? Why do you need it? And often when you have a team that's designing the forms, you'll have marketers, you'll have compliance, you'll have all sorts of people saying, "Oh, we need to know their interests, we need to know their email, we need to know the phone number." So you have that sort of pain point, and often the biggest pain point we see consistently, outside of asking for passwords, because that's all that when we look at our data, asking for passwords is always the number one drop off of the common form questions, for various reasons, but is telephone number. And I'll just flip onto another slide here that actually the question is, do you actually need the phone number? That's always the question we would ask people optimizing the forms, because it's become so. I guess maybe it's a holdover from the days when people only had phone numbers, they didn't have email addresses. You just ported a form across that could be 40 years old. Let's ask for the phone number. um, and
Definitely.
so and actually, particularly in sectors like e-commerce, but also finance as well, people are always saying, why do you need my phone number? You have my email address. I don't want you calling me. But it's asked and it's often compulsory. And also, how do you, well, I've got the point in here is about the phone number. It's also about how you ask for it, because that's another problem. When you ask for it, you end up, validation errors all over the place, because phone numbers are, they're formatted different in different countries with different people. Do you have a dash, etc.? So
Yeah.
the example we've got live here is actually not a bad example. It is slightly restrictive, but at least it's formatting the number for you, so you don't have to worry about whether there's spaces or whatever. And the amount of times we've seen errors returned because someone put a space in and they don't, and that, that's one of the easiest problems to solve. We see that all the time. But typically, we'd recommend that fields, such as phone number, you would just allow a freestyle, because at the end of the day, that's what the user wants to put in. And most of the time, if you are going to call them, it's a human who's going to be making the call, so they can interpret that.
Yeah. Still on the topic of phone numbers, I've seen myself a huge lift just by tagging the input element as a
Yeah.
telephone number, so
Mhm.
that on mobile devices, I think because of HTML5,
Yeah.
you get the nice phone keys
Mhm.
instead of a full keyboard, which you can
Yeah.
only use to enter numbers.
Mhm. Yeah.
That alone, just like not even a full line of code, made
Mhm.
a huge difference. So making
Yeah.
sure it's tagged up, and then of course accessibility as well. While
Mhm.
you're at it, you might as well
Mhm.
tag for accessibility, so that somebody on say a screen reader
Mhm.
can still navigate your form.
Yeah.
Accessibility, I think, is also a huge sort of a category of conversion problems
Mhm.
as well, and it's often neglected, particularly for like the smaller companies that
Yeah.
it takes resources and skills to know how to tag. Even if
Mhm.
you're using a tool like Google Lighthouse to assess your accessibility, you still
Mhm.
need to address each point it finds,
Mhm.
and I think a lot of companies just kind of go, oh, it's too much work, right? But like you're quite literally like, or not literally, but you're leaving customers like in the dark.
Mhm.
They're not able to even in some cases see the form, right, and get through it.
Mhm.
There's no chance.
Yeah. No, no, definitely accessibility is. I mean, it's a whole other topic in itself, and we've done webinars and got lots of stuff on our website about it, because it's an issue, and often you don't know it's an issue because it's only for a certain segment of your audience. So that's why it's important to try and segment the audience, and also segment things such as device, because you, again, classic thing is you have form designers optimizing for desktop, they get to mobile, either that accessibility or just general UX, and they don't consider it. So you've got that whole testing piece. I know Craig is on the call. Obviously, he's always advising about a certain set of devices that you optimize, that you test on to make sure the form works, or your website in general, I suppose. So
Yeah.
it's a tricky one. So certainly accessibility is big.
Yeah, I do want to acknowledge some of the more technical folks in the audience, and I want to steer this briefly towards a kind of a technical direction. But before we do that, I wanted
Yeah.
to say one more thing actually on the passwords. If you can go back to your sort of password slide, that would be great. There are companies out there that are finding really creative ways to not even require a password. Now, some industries you need a strong password, to basically, avoid fraud, that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
right? But for some products, like for example, OpenTable, I believe does this, where
Yeah.
I have an account with OpenTable. It's for restaurant reservations, like tables. But I don't think I enter a password. They basically like
Yeah.
text me or email me a link every time I want to do something, and that works for me because I don't need I don't need to remember a password.
Yeah.
I mean, I use a password manager now, so it wouldn't be a big deal. But before I did,
Yeah.
I didn't need to remember it, and because it wasn't like high stakes, high security,
Yeah.
it's like worst case somebody figures out a way to reserve a table in my name. Doesn't cost
Yeah.
anyone anything except for the
Yeah.
restaurant. But that's so rare, right? Like, why would
Yeah.
anyone want to do that even? So,
Yeah.
if you can, depending on your product, your industry, find a way to not require a password or offer alternative logins with like more limited permissions if they're using that alternative.
Yeah.
That can be a good way to reduce friction in a form as well. Have you come across any of those?
Yeah, I mean, social sign-in is also the obvious one as well.
Yeah,
So we often get asked about that, and yeah, generally speaking, it's good, but it depends on the sector. There's a bit more sensitivity around financial services and
definitely.
data privacy, but for something that's B2C and fairly low impact, then it works well. You've got to be careful about the audience because we've seen people try to do it where there's an older audience. So whatever you do, you still got to do the classic email password thing. But you've also kind of got to get the passwords right. And we always say you shouldn't be overly restrictive. It's not necessary. Minimum 8 characters. That's pretty much all you need. Let people use special characters if they want, but don't force it. And that's kind of a lot of the advice that's out there in terms of that gives you enough entropy to make it secure, without making it less secure by meaning that people are going to forget it and write it down, which is the issue that you commonly come across.
Yeah, and so when it comes to experimentation and passwords and these sorts of problems, it really actually starts with analytics. So that's why Optimizely partners
Yeah.
with analytics companies, because we don't do analytics for the
Yeah.
most part. Certainly not in our experimentation products outside of
Yeah.
experiments.
Yeah.
So we, rather than try to compete in a very crowded field full of people like Zuko that have some really great
Yeah.
stuff, and we'd have to compete. We'd rather partner and specialize in experimentation. So to kind of paint the full picture, you might use a tool like Zuko. Analytics to be able to see that there is friction at certain points, right?
Yeah.
So it starts with data, right? Data usually doesn't come from Optimizely in that case,
Yeah.
and then you hypothesize, if we remove this field, I think more people will get to the next page, or will complete the form, right? And you take those hypotheses that need to be testable and you can translate them into experiments. For the experiments, you create variations. So it's like one version of the form with, one version of the form without in the simple case. And then you run your experiment to see. And rather than confirm something, you're actually trying to reject something, right? So if you fail to reject a null hypothesis over a long period of time, you can get confidence, which can be measured in statistical significance, to know that there's a high likelihood, usually 5% chance of a false positive, that you are going in the right direction by, say, removing the field, right? And then you'd roll that out potentially with a tool like ours, our feature flags and targeted deliveries, and then without needing a developer, that allows you to release that new version of the form. So that's kind of like the full cycle, and it is a long cycle, and that's for basically one experiment. And the most successful companies are running hundreds per year, right? They're constantly looking at their analytics, they're constantly running experiments, and over time conversions go up. Have you seen much of that in action?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I suppose the challenge for us is making sure that the experimentation program extends to the form. And again, you probably see more of this because we see the people who do it, we see people who don't do it, but obviously we don't see the big breadth of experimentation that goes on compared to what you do. And I think that for us is a challenge, and it's one we're always trying to push. Hence the reason we have integrations with tools like Optimizely, because we want to make it as easy as possible to do it, and also then it just gives people the detailed data as well, because you can look at overall conversion rate. And that's great for an A/B test if you remove a field or change an error message or some instructional copy. But actually, if you can look at the detailed behavior behind that, again, it can help you refine your hypotheses, because maybe your hypothesis was or wasn't rejected, but actually you can then help you refine to the next hypothesis, because you can see, okay, they didn't go from field A to field B anymore, they now jumped to field D. Oh, we made a change there. Okay, so right, maybe that's our next hypothesis. So it allows you to do that.
Yeah, and the pros will take data from analytics tools like Zuko, merge it with data from Optimizely. There are a variety of ways to do that, probably out of scope for this call, but you essentially put the data side by side, and those analytics tools provide a much richer picture for analysis. Sure, our tool will kind of give you statistical significance with a lot of rigor. It'll try to make it as easy as possible to understand, but it still isn't the full picture, and analytics really helps you get there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And just a slight plug for a bit of content we've created recently. It was an ebook on how to use data to optimize forms. So rather than just general UX advice, it's okay, these are the metrics you want to look at. This is what it does. This is what it might mean, and this is what hypothesis it might lead to. So I'll probably share that if I can on the LinkedIn Live afterwards, just a link to that. Nice. And also, just so everyone knows, we're going to take this recording, and I'll try and share it with everyone. Jitander's just asked, but the recording, it is recorded. So if you've signed up via LinkedIn for this, I'll just ping you a direct message and with the link to watch the video afterwards as well.
Nice. So I want to be aware of time. Do we have a few minutes to kind of get technical?
If you want to get technical, you get technical. So
let's do it, because I want to make sure that folks that are already familiar with a lot of what we're talking about still get some value from this. So I want to kind of talk about the topic of SPAs, single page applications. So by contrast, more traditional sort of development frameworks like, say, Ruby on Rails, you would have the first page of the form, you'd hit submit, it would make an API call, it would receive HTML in the response to load the next page. And it's what I would call a full page refresh. So it's going to reload the header and the footer, even though those don't change. It may reload the navigation, even though that's not changing, just to change out, the form page, right? And the validation style is completely different for that, because it can be validated more or less on the back end, a little bit differently than it would be for more of an SPA. SPAs, most common of which is like React, Vue, or Angular, and a bunch of other JavaScript frameworks for this at this point, kind of basically would load the, let's say, 4-part form all at once in most cases, but really only show one at a time. And then there's logic in the code for switching between the two. And so I found really a huge conversion lift actually with Optimizely as I converted a major flow, our highest level flow from Ruby on Rails full page refresh based all the way to an SPA. The form itself, the experiment was make the form look and feel exactly the same, just eliminate the full page refresh between the form pages. And that was huge, particularly for mobile customers, particularly for those on slow internet connections. We could actually lazy load the kind of follow-up pages in the background while they're completing one of the pages. So I was curious, how you kind of see the difference between the two in your day-to-day.
Well, it's interesting. I've probably not seen it in as much detail as that. So I guess your hypothesis was switching to an SPA, improving load speed, improves conversion. So we have seen it. The Zuko data won't necessarily prove that, because we check the interactions with the forms. What we could do is you can look at the before and after, or if you could run it alongside, we run an A/B test. But what we do see is that when people do move, this is more from a single. We've seen people move from multi-step forms, which are full page loads, sometimes with slightly different URLs to SPAs, we have seen improvements, probably more in the range of between 2 to 4 or 5%. I don't know, but which is still pretty big.
Yeah,
To
I
be
was gonna say,
fair.
which could be huge. I mean, that
Yeah,
could be hundreds
to
of
be
thousands of
fair,
dollars or
yeah, to
more.
be fair, but so I don't have a huge base to do it, and obviously the client you're talking about probably has significant sample sizes and everything.
Yeah, yeah, we had it was hard to detect for sure,
Yeah,
but it was there.
yeah,
And I'd like to toss out a couple more tips for the more
yeah,
advanced CROers out
yeah,
there. So one tip is a little bit less about optimization for the user in the flow,
mm,
and this is saving the data they input first locally, so that if they say refresh the page,
mm,
the fields are still pre-populated. Basically saves the progress locally, let's say in the browser if you're using a browser, so that you're kind of like, the idea is you always want to push the customer forward, and really prevent them from making a mistake that would cause them to go backward, right? So saving that
mm,
locally, but then also, and I think this is less obvious, saving it in a backend as it's entered. So even before an account is created, when you traditionally start to save, trying to find a way to save it under an anonymous ID. So that you can always look back and kind of see data before you otherwise could have, right? That
mm,
data can be used for machine learning models if you want to get super fancy with it. But it's also just good analytics data to kind of have. And the last kind of tip I'd throw out there too is the concept of the nudge. So this comes from, I believe, a UChicago professor, and I'm from UChicago background. And so I read this book,
yeah,
Sunstein and Taylor, I
mm,
believe, Taylor,
yeah,
on nudging customers. And so I actually
mm,
built a service, and I believe you can buy stuff like this, but
mm,
I built it
yeah,
where PMs could experiment on nudging customers, basically reminding them. So if they drop off, they haven't made a change to a field in 15 minutes. Let's send
yeah,
them a text message if we have their phone
yeah,
number. Let's send them an email if we have that, and then give them a link to just pick up right where they left off. Right?
yeah,
You guys have probably experienced this, but this was tremendously
mm,
successful as well.
yeah. So was this in the States? Sorry, there.
Yes, this was in the States.
Yeah, yeah. In Europe, there might be some issues around consent, GDPR, etc. There's
Yeah.
depending on how you execute it. So I've seen less of it certainly in Europe, because I know obviously in the States you can do things like partial form capture, which under
Yeah.
GDPR is
Iffy.
probably probably illegal in Europe. So I don't think there's been a test case for it, but yeah. But
Yeah.
certainly stuff like that I can see working, but there is the data privacy factor.
Yeah, totally. All right,
Right.
back to you. You let me get technical. I really appreciate it, but
Yeah, yeah, no,
I
that's
wanted to get
fine.
those points out for all the experts in the audience.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm conscious we've done half an hour, which is what we said we'd do. So let's move on to if there's any questions out there. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them through in the comments. I think we've got at least one through already. So we've got one from Arthur. Says, have you used eye tracking, or could it be a good thing to use eye tracking to detect pain points in the sign up process? So I mean, I've got. I'll answer a bit first, and then you can
Yeah.
go on to it. So we've actually got something on this that we conducted some experiments, and it's on our website. And this was specific. It's around a few things, but the example I'll use is the date of birth field. So I think eye tracking is great to develop your hypothesis. It's hard to prove it because to get a sample size that's relevant is going to be extremely costly. But what we did was an experiment around the date of birth format. So obviously, there's pretty much a different date of birth format on each site. So you have people with drop downs, you have text boxes, you have different ways of doing it. So what we did was use eye tracking across a number of those different patterns. And what we found is that the smoothest and quickest eye pathway was just 3 simple text boxes with 2 numbers in each of them. So, which kind of makes sense. It's just 6 key presses and done. But what we saw is where you use drop downs, you saw people eyes going up and down, spending a lot more time. You say, for those of us who are older, when you click on a date of birth year and it starts at 2023, and you've got to scroll down and scroll down and scroll down to find your year of birth, it's painful. The user experience wasn't great. So we've used it. That obviously gives us a hypothesis. You can then test, okay, well, the hypothesis is that we're going to use 3 text boxes for date of birth, and then prove it with a bigger sample size. So essentially, that's our experience of eye tracking. I don't know if you what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I could actually talk about this for a while. I'll try to keep myself to one
Yeah,
minute.
yeah,
There's actually multiple kinds of eye tracking. So, Facebook, I think, pioneered this actually almost a decade ago, and they basically approximated eye tracking using the viewport. So, if you were scrolling through your timeline and there was a post in the middle of it or towards the top of it, they basically assumed you were reading it after a certain period of time.
yeah.
And then you can use that as a metric to optimize for with, say, experiments. If you're looking to optimize for engagement, for example, and I believe that's what they were doing. So that sort of was rudimentary. These days, there's open source, even JavaScript libraries. There are also SaaS products you can use to do in situ sort of eye tracking predictions. Like we believe based on the mouse location and the viewport, their eyes are about here. You can pass that into a model and make decisions on it live. That's pretty cool. But the third category of eye tracking that I'm aware of anyway is one of the newest and one of the coolest. And this is actually before you run an experiment, before production, when you actually just have mock-ups.
Yeah.
You can pass it into basically a predictive eye tracking model where it's less about tracking and more about predicting where users' eyes will go. Based on a ton of learning data that these sorts of companies have. And so before you build the thing, you can see how the flow, at least in terms of eye movement, would go. And you can see like, oh no, I don't want their eyes all the way over there. That's call to actions over here, right? Might choose a different image, right? Like people's are usually drawn to people's eyes, actually, is a pro tip too. And so if you have an image with somebody's eyes in it, they're more likely to get eyes,
Yeah.
so that sort of thing too. So yeah, using it all, I think it's all beneficial.
Cool. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that last one sounds very interesting. I'd love to see that tested in real life. I've not
Yeah.
seen it myself. But so moving on to other questions, Jitanda asks, what's the best way to analyze form field engagement data and experiments related to the same? So obviously, I'm slightly biased that analyzing form field engagement data is using a tool like Zuko, not necessarily Zuko, but ones that looks at things such as abandonment rate, how long people are spending on the field, do they come back, what's the corrections, are error messages triggering, when do they trigger, those sort of things. It's about getting a tool that has that level of data, whichever tool you may pick. I mean, it is possible to hack something together using Google Tag Manager, but that would take a heck of a lot of time and a lot of dev time, so I wouldn't do that. And then experiments related to the same, I suppose. Yeah, it's looking at the changes. If you do you're doing an experiment, so making a change in error message or copy, looking at how does that affect your dwell time, how does it affect your abandonment rate or your volume, and how people are spending and the errors, and using the deeper layer of data to do that. If that makes sense. And if your thoughts are, Griffin?
Yeah, briefly. So for combining the two categories of products that we're here representing, experimentation products, analytics products, usually the pattern is in the experimentation side. Whenever you make a decision, like this user should get variation too, you basically tell the analytics provider. You basically have a callback that says, hey, by the way, this person received this variation. And then you can see that usually represented in the analytics tool. That's kind of a common approach. It does require some development effort. Another approach is a bit more like ETL based, where you just need the data from both tools to end up in the same place and share a common ID, and then you can join them. So it's a bit more like a Snowflake data lake approach, where you're not really sending events live, but you can nonetheless draw similar distinctions in retrospect by looking at the data and joining it. I see larger companies leaning towards the latter and less mature companies leaning towards the former, but both work.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'm not sure we've got a lot of comments, which are all sort of relevant. So some from Craig, and I don't know if there's any other specific questions that will be there. See, Craig's made a comment about the eye tracking model, AI, that he's seen wildly different results with actual eye tracking. Now, have you? Well, we don't want to dwell too much on the eye tracking, but obviously, I guess it's a model that's being constantly refined.
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too much either, but if you want to check it out, there's a company that I've come across called Attention Insight that does this.
Yeah.
And you can read their white papers and see. They claim, I think, pretty high predictive power, but yeah, I would still be skeptical, and I think you're right to be as well.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I say there's lots of other things that have been shared in the comments. Marcus and Craig and others have shared some interesting stuff. So because I think there's a slight delay on LinkedIn Live, we'll give it another 10, 20 seconds to see if anyone wants to drop any final questions in. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, this has been really fun.
Yeah, no, it is. I say with forms, I could talk for hours about. Also, I mean, we had lots of just examples prepared in case we spoke about them and see where it took us. But there's all sorts of other things that we could talk about that we didn't talk about. Number of fields, we touched on it, but that's a whole new thing, other topic of conversation. How many fields you should have, but yeah.
While we're waiting for, I think, the last questions to roll in, there may not be any, but I'd kind of summarize this by saying, like, to really achieve conversion rate optimization, it really helps to have both kinds of tools.
Yeah.
An analytics provider like Zuko to be able to get a sense of where the friction is. Optimizely, we can't really do that unless you're running experiments on every field. It's not realistic. We don't do that, right?
Yeah.
But you use a tool like Zuko to determine where the problems are, to build your hypotheses, and then you can use a tool like Optimizely, both web or feature experimentation, to test solutions to those problems.
Yeah.
That's really the pattern here. That I hopefully we get that across.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, one final question, which I'll take from Aaron, because actually it's something relates close to my heart, which is if a form had 10 fields, for example, and each step showed a low abandonment rate between 1 to 5%, but a user gets the submit button on the form and the abandonment rate is, say, 70%, is this unusual? Short answer, no. We see it all the time. And often this is because error messages are not being validated until the submit button. We'd generally recommend inline validation, so you tell people immediately what the issues are. But there are ways, if you want to get where the true abandonment is happening, because obviously people see a sea of red and they go, scared off, and they leave. But actually, if you want to get a clue about what they're doing, it's using a report such as we've got field flow in Zuko, which will show you, okay, people are clicking submit, but they're failing to complete. And then they jump back to field, the date of birth field most prevalently. And you can find out quickly from that as well what is going on. So you kind of want that extra layer in to do it. So it's not an uncommon problem.
Yeah. Another technology or technique you can use for that sort of problem is like session recording. Don't know how that works in the EU, but in the US, you can basically, it's kind of weird, watch a user use your site more or less. And you sample at something like 10%, and you can kind of correlate that to other analytics data, and you can see like, okay, people experiencing this friction, I want to go watch it. Yeah. And then you may realize that like something's flying off the viewport because they're on a BlackBerry or something like that. Like sometimes it's really hard to know what's wrong until you see it. So there's no replacement for that, I think. But analytics, you can achieve it from multiple angles, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No, definitely. We tend to use it with a session recording. So you can use Zuko to see what the volume is, to isolate the problem. Then you go and look at a session and see someone, and so you can further refine your hypothesis. Okay, totally. One last question then from Gareth. Any thoughts on date pickers on mobile? Many travel websites use their own HTML date pickers, which aren't very accessible because they want to stay on brand. Well, I suppose the thoughts are, yes, there's a lot of bad UX date pickers out there. Again, I would, always have the option to allow someone to quickly put in a date using text boxes, because on mobile it's slightly different. They might be more likely to want. It depends what you're talking. Again, if you're talking about date of birth, or you're talking about booking a flight in a week's time, there's slightly different interactions there. But yeah, we've seen some terrible executions with it. But I'd allow someone to put the manual date picker in as well. I don't know. You've probably seen your fair share of bad date pickers, Griffin.
Yeah, I have. I don't think there's one silver bullet solution to
Mm,
them, but usually they're at least rooted in an open source library, unless you're somebody
mm,
like Airbnb that really is going to build it from scratch.
mm.
And so I would say prioritize accessibility as you're picking that library. It's kind of it'll give you a good foundation to build on. Sometimes it's as easy as just for your branding, rounding the corners and recoloring it, and then it's close enough, right? Rather than building it from scratch. But yeah, it's a common problem, and you'd think that somebody would maybe, for lack of a better phrase here, like submit a pull request to to the HTML5
Yeah.
gods
Mhm.
to create a better date picker. But I think that I forget the name of the body that kind of oversees those sorts of things, but they, I think, move fairly slowly and
Yeah.
conservatively. So I wouldn't hold your breath for something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that seems like an opportune time to wrap it up. Almost to say, as with all of these things, you need to experiment and test using the
Totally.
tools, develop your hypotheses, test them. Yeah, if nothing else, obviously, I'm sure most people here know that and are actively doing it. But it's been fun, Griffin. So we'll wind that up here. As I say, the recording will be available. So keep your eye on the page. At which you can relook at it actually because it's LinkedIn Live. I think you can play it again, but we'll also share the recording as well.
Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you very much. It's been fun. Thanks.